start sharing my screen. So thanks everybody for joining us. So before I go ahead and get started with my little review of our slides from Monday, I wanted to introduce our two guest speakers today, Alana Cronk and Julia Albee, who both presented at the Big East Conference last March. Yes, back then, back in the spring semester of 2022. Alana, would you mind introducing yourself, telling our Laidlaw scholars a little bit about yourself and your research? And then I'll have Julia do the same, and then I'll do our slides.
Yeah. So hello, my name's Alana. I'm a senior in the college, majoring in philosophy, double minoring in English and public health. My research is, I've been doing research since the fall of my freshman year. I knew pretty early on that I was interested in humanities research specifically. And I think my research interests and projects throughout the few years I've been in college have really varied, which I think is really important if you are interested in research, to just go with what's interesting to you and kind of keep an open mind to different avenues, because that's what college is all about. And I've gone from, I started with like an ethnographic study my freshman year with like IRB approval, sending surveys to people, analyzing their responses about stranger harassment, to I did one about logic and like literature. I've done one on, I worked with a whole bunch of museums this summer with like anthropologists and archaeologists studying epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, and cultural vitalization, and indigenous basketry. I'm working on co-authoring a paper right now about indigenous and disability sovereignty, and planning a conference about disability studies and indigenous studies. So I think it's important to explore what's cool to you, and you learn a lot that way because there's a lot out there. I don't know. And I think leaving college, you'll have a broad spectrum of different things to pull from. As far as my research experience at Georgetown, in total in college, I've presented at 7 conferences. The most recent of which was the Big East Conference. The CRF was super supportive, and this is a really amazing resource, which isn't at all universities. I would definitely encourage everybody here to utilize the CRF throughout your years at Georgetown as well, because there's really amazing, dedicated people there who are really dedicated to helping you succeed in whatever it is you're trying to achieve in the land of research and fellowships, and they're really great to give you feedback. But yeah, Julia and I went to the Big East Conference. We went to New York last year. It was super cool. We stayed in the coolest hotel. We presented at Madison Square Garden, this really nice lobby there, and then we got to watch a game. It was super cool. It was super nerd fest, but in the best way possible. So that's a little bit about me.
I don't know how I'm gonna follow that, but that's okay. I'm Julia. I am a recent graduate of Georgetown. So I graduated from the now retired School of Nursing and Health Studies. I was a human science major and a chemistry minor, and now I am spending the year doing research at Mayo Clinic. So I am a science researcher, biomedical researcher. A little bit about my research background. I finished an honors thesis in human science that looked at something called a non-coding RNA. It's basically an RNA that doesn't make proteins, called NORAD. If you've heard of the Santa tracker, you've heard that name before. They are not the same, as Advait would laugh if he were here right now. But I looked at that RNA specifically in the context of osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer, and different types of damage to DNA within our cells. And in the lab that I work in at Mayo, I do something very similar along the line of DNA damage as well. I did not present as much as Alana did. I have only presented three times, Big East and then the Georgetown Undergraduate Research Conference. But the scientific background that I got from doing that was really, really helpful. And like Alana said, I think the CRF is a really great resource that, especially as someone who has now graduated, you don't realize how important it is until you don't have that anymore or you look back on it. I think I learned a lot from the work that I did with the CRF. You guys are all really lucky to have them as a resource. Colleen, Bill, Lauren, I miss all of you. I loved all of you. I loved going into your little lobby and getting snacks. So yeah, take advantage of them. The best resource. I learned a lot from them, even though they're not science people. I think that's one of the biggest things I can tell you too, to go off of what Alana said. Just because someone's not within your discipline doesn't mean that they can't provide you really, really valuable feedback. It's actually more helpful to have someone who's outside of your discipline give you feedback, because that means that people outside of your scope will understand the work that you're doing too. So take advantage of it, take advantage of your peers, and take advantage of Lauren, Bill, and Colleen, because I love them.
Thank you both. That was not part of the assignment to, sing the praises of the CRF, but we appreciate it. Before I have Alana and Julia share a little bit about their perspectives on creating research posters, doing their own research, and presenting, I want to just cover really quickly some of the slides that we covered on Monday, just as a quick refresher for folks. So we'll run past this part super quickly. Oh, no, go back. So really super quickly, with research posters, your main goal is that you're providing a visual representation of the research project that you've undertaken. They're typically accompanied with an oral presentation, especially something like Big East, that is a research like a competition / conference. There are rounds of judging where judges will come by, you'll present your research in a specific time period, and then you're judged on both the presentation as well as the poster itself. The Laidlaw conference that you all will be attending is not a competition for the posters. It is just a poster presentation session, but it is still good to kind of get, you are still presenting, so it'll still be good to hear about those perspectives. The main elements that are included in a research poster do change somewhat from discipline to discipline, but the main elements that are often included in research posters are your abstract or introduction. So just a very brief overview of the background of your work, what you're focusing on, what your research question is, your methods and/or methodologies. So again, as a reminder, methods will refer to the tools or resources, steps that you've taken to address your research question. As your methodology is often, again, can vary from discipline to discipline, but often refer to the lens or framework that you are now analyzing your work through. So methods are your tools, methodologies are sort of the overall analysis and how you're looking at your data to come to your results. And so the other sections will be your results and your conclusions. Again, typical, but not always required. Things to keep in mind, you always want to keep your audience in mind. So depending on the conference that you're attending, your audience is going to look a little bit different. So something like the Laidlaw conference, the Big East conference, where you have with the undergraduate research conference at Georgetown, where you have many people from many various disciplines, and thus also viewers, your audience is going to be from many different disciplines. You want to keep things a little bit more general than you would if you were presenting to an audience of your disciplinary peers or folks that are more knowledgeable about your discipline. So keeping in mind what is the baseline of your audience for your project and your work. Keeping your key points pretty high level, so highlighting those 3 to 4 main points for each section, as well as the larger scope of the project. Your message, so with your content, remembering that there will be more opportunities to kind of dive into those specific details later on or in your presentation. So again, making sure to kind of keep things at sort of high level on the poster as your presentation will dive into those more specific details. Visual appeal, it's still a poster, it's something that you want to make sure it's eye-catching, it's compelling, and this extends to your content as much as your format. So you want to make sure that the content is engaging, that you want your audience to continue to look at it, to continue reading it, both from like what it is that you're putting on the poster itself, from the content piece, as well as like how are you formatting it? Are the, is there enough negative space that it's not going to hurt my eyes to be like looking at this thing? Is it super text heavy? Sometimes it makes sense if it's super text heavy, depending on your discipline. But if you can break your text up with images or graphs and things of that nature, it does help. And if you can't, for whatever reason, whether it's like that wasn't the type of research that you were doing, or that wasn't the type of project that you were working on, and so it is going to inherently be very text heavy, finding other ways to kind of break up that formatting and break up your poster in different ways. Again, other things to keep in mind: guidelines and expectations for the presentations, as well as the poster itself. So as we were discussing before folks hopped on the call, it's a little, most people I think are used to a horizontal or landscape orientation for research posters, at least here in the US. Our posters will be portrait orientation or vertically oriented. As those are the guidelines given to us by the conference organizers. As you're thinking about what to put on your poster, creating a storyboard or plan ahead of time to help you really draft those different elements and think about what's going to go on your poster before you actually sit down to create it. Again, poster elements, we went through this in more detail on Monday, and we'll kind of do a little bit of as we said, we'll have some time for Alana and Julia to show off their posters in just a moment. So you'll see some examples of these, but every poster is going to have a title section at the top with the title of your research, your name, the name of the organization or university that funded your project, as well as this is also where you want to highlight your PI or the other researchers that you worked with, as well as if you did any, or if your research required IRB approval, you can put your IRB study number in the title section as well. How you decide to orient that, whether it's in the main section of text or off to the side, maybe under one of the logos, that's acceptable, but somewhere where it's going to be easily seen and identified for anyone that's walking by looking at your poster when you're not standing in front of it. The technical content will be in the main body of the poster. So again, this is your abstract, your introduction, any relevant literature that you may want to highlight, again, if that's necessary or required, your results, your discussion or conclusion. You do want to make sure to cite anything that is that you note specifically on your poster. You don't need to include all of your citations for your entire project, but you do want to cite those things that you cite on the poster or you will cite in your presentation, and then acknowledgements as well as any visuals. So any additional visual aids, so like graphs and images and things. Things to think about in terms of organization. So again, you want your layout to be relatively uniform, so that your elements have a sort of clearly identifiable pathway for your audience to view and read. You want a good amount of negative space. So again, this helps for your audience to easily take in what's on the poster and also have a consistent style throughout. And if you want to know more about formatting stuff, you can look back to the presentation that I did on Monday, because I want to make sure that I give Alana and Julia plenty of time, so as well as time for questions. So I am going to let Alana and Julia decide on their own who's going to go first. And if I have the posters that the two of you shared with me, so I can pull those up if you want, unless you have them up.
I have mine ready to go.
Okay.
So just talking through like why I included what is the prompt.
Yeah, so a little bit of like why you included the different aspects of each element, and like also like what went into your thought process around drafting this particular poster.
Okay, yeah. So I'll say, because I've made a bunch of different kind of presentations for conferences, the thing that like remains consistent through them all, through whatever kind of discipline I'm working in, is there's always some kind of section setting you up for like before you get into the meat of whatever it is that you studied. So some kind of background, some kind of intro, some kind of abstract, some kind of methods, whatever it is you're picking varies on the exact like research you do. And then somewhere in the middle of the poster ish is kind of like the meat of what you really got into and whatever kind of research that you did. Like science people, this is where a lot of the like charts and numbers plots come in. Humanities is a little different. Sometimes there's photos here like with pictures of what you did or whatever it is, and then the end is some kind of discussion, conclusion, sometimes references, acknowledgements. So usually like those 3 key sections. So for this, what I did was I took a capstone project that I did for a disability studies class, and I kind of took that big paper and made it into a poster. The abstract, I decided to do a bulleted abstract. I think it was Julia, were you did a bulleted abstract, right? I took inspo from Julia because it just didn't look good to put like how long are abstracts? They're not that long, like 200 word, couple hundred words of just like 8-point font. Did not look good. I knew realistically no one's gonna take the time to sit there to read the whole thing, sit through that, like, no, it just wasn't going to help anybody. So by kind of highlighting the like main sections of my abstract and kind of differentiating them with the like bolding it so that people can even just skim through whatever it is that they need for context even within this is helpful, and just making it a 1-sentence little boom, here's the background, boom, here's my methods, it's disability studies philosophy, my discussion, all right, here's the point, you know. And then introduction is a great place to set up like key information that you need. So like terms of art, setting the stage for what it is we're even talking about, especially at general interest conferences. The person next to you could be psychology, and the person next to them could be history, and the person next to them could be chemistry. So it's really key to like, all right, you need to, sometimes there's stuff that you don't even think you need to explain. You're like, yeah, duh, this is a disability studies project to you. But the person just next to you is just listening to like physics. They really need the stage completely set. Introduction is a great place to do that. So I set up, okay, we're talking about disability studies, everybody. And I can't just assume that everybody knows what disability studies is. There's some stuff that might, again, seem obvious to you because it's what you spend tens, hundreds of hours, you know, doing, but we got to make sure that everybody, especially at general interest conferences, we really got to keep our audience in mind and make sure that we're explaining things to the fullest extent or at a very basic level. So I kind of explain, all right, disability studies examines normalized practices of institutionalizing and dehumanizing disabled people. And I kind of tailor my definition to not be necessarily inclusive of all of the discipline, but just basically how it's necessary to understand in the context of the research that I'm doing. And then this was a really important term of art that I was going to be referencing a lot during my presentation, the political relational model of disability, which is obviously this really specific term that I get from this one author. So I thought it was important to, okay, this is the moment to define what that is, since it's kind of like the crux of the presentation. And then I just kind of outline, all right, here is the problem that like inspired the project. Here is my sketch of what I see going on in the world, and that the meat of this presentation will spend time examining. And I thought, you know, I could just write it all out, but having a visual, even though I don't have like data or pictures necessarily, because this is kind of like a conceptual, qualitative research thing, it was still useful, I think, to go in with Google. I think I did this in like Google, I don't know, some Google program, and make just a quick little diagram to just symbolically represent my understanding of the problem. That way, it was just easier, like more eye-catching, simpler to follow. If it's like, okay, if they're not going to read all of this, maybe they can understand that there's something with systems and safety and psychiatric people, which leads to some kind of carceral response, which leads to some kind of harm. And if they can get that through this representation, that they're going to have a really good time understanding the meat of my presentation. And the meat of which would be these 3 sections. Now, in the like humanities, what your little 3 sections or however many sections will be like will vary. Sometimes it's like a problem impact solution. Sometimes, I mean, in science, it's totally different. It's like data and stuff. Or sometimes it'll be, here's in philosophy, maybe your argument, objection, counter argument. So I don't know. Your sections will vary, but for this study, I was just really interested in exploring kind of as a survey, the different areas of psychiatry that I thought were carceral, meaning related to imprisonment or incarceration. And so I selected these 3 areas of psychiatry to survey in order to make this argument that I think that there is this relationship between carcerality, right, imprisonment, and our practice of psychiatry. And that's why I selected these 3 sections in particular, which is, I'll admit, a hair unusual, but it was meant to be kind of this like surveying sort of project, which is why I chose to do it that way. And then here, I was just trying to do the same thing as I did over here with, all right, I have a lot to say here and a lot of really specific information to get across, but I don't think a big chunk of text will really do me good. So I try to just represent it somehow symbolically, somehow visually, just to break up the monotony of words, because nobody's going to really want to read through paragraphs of information when you're in this kind of setting. So here I explain what active rescue is, which is when someone discloses suicidal ideation to a hotline, and an operator enacts the protocol, and then they share personal information disclosed by the caller with police or hospitals, and the police are usually sent to the person who calls whatever hotline it is. And then I'm getting back to this over here where I'm saying, all right, there's some kind of, with these safety narratives that we're exploring, some kind of justification. They say active rescue is based on evidence-based risk assessments, but really there's some harms that are paired, and we won't go through. I'm not trying to give you all the whole presentation here, but I'm just trying to show you there is this like symbolic visual relationship I'm trying to communicate in the poster, somehow in hopefully what is clear or something that would allow somebody who's interested to navigate the information a little easier on their own. And then here I, do a little philosophy stuff that was interesting to me at the moment, right? I pull up their justification for the process. I pull up a moral justification for the process, and I pull up an example of an organization that has really uniquely and kind of unusually decided to reject this process because they see the harms in the practice of active rescue. And then I move on to the second area of psychiatry that I wanted to survey, which was inpatient care. And it's a little sassy of me to put care in scare quotes, but I mean, when I'm making an argument about how this is a harmful process, I felt that called attention to my argument that inpatient care facilities for psychiatry are actually capable of harm. And as you can see, I just use bolded headings and along with their citation, so they can find it over here, in order to just make this information a little easier to navigate. I understand how hard it is when you're you're so close to your research and you're like, all of this is so important to me. But if I had to critique anything about this poster, I would try to find a way to even remove more words from it to make it even easier to navigate to a viewer, because realistically, the person listening to you is not going to take away every single fine point that you're communicating. They're going to take away a few key things that felt memorable to them. And if you can do your best to think about, like, what is the absolute most important parts of my research? How can I distill it down to the most concentrated bits possible, and understanding that if people are interested, they'll ask you questions and you'll get to pull out that really interesting information to you later. That's ideal. So if I had one critique about, this section right here, I would probably go back and do another pass and maybe try to get rid of some of these words. But what you want to do is always be breaking up things to make it just as easy to look at as possible, as clear as possible. And here I just had 3 little sections that I thought were important to talk about if we're talking about the relationship between carcerality, right, imprisonment, and inpatient psychiatric institutions. I pulled up, because we were in New York for the presentation, so I pulled up the actual like wording of New York's own policies. And I brought up how just 3 doctors together can just imprison somebody for 60 days if they felt that they were dangerous. And I talked about how that's related to carcerality. And then the 3rd section, same deal, you get the vibes. Here's the information I thought was pertinent to talking about this relationship and ethics. And here was a really interesting study that I kind of based my inferences off of, which talked about how even in penal incarceration, things we think of like jails and prisons, disability is overrepresented there. And so there's, again, just this other avenue of creating this relationship between carcerality and psychiatry. And then I had my conclusion, right? So I thought about, all right, there's no more quantitative. I realized that a lot of my studies weren't very recent, because guess what? People don't really like being super forthright about how they're imprisoning and unfortunately, in some cases, even killing people in these psychiatric institutions. So I called for, all right, here's a weakness in the data that I'm basing these qualitative conclusions off of. I talk about the importance of disability studies overall. We want to make these like big conceptual kind of conclusions, not just about what you immediately studied, but all right, how does this relate to the discipline overall? How does this relate to like everyday life? So I talk about disability studies is necessary because it encourages this kind of critical examinations, which might actively be harming people and lead us towards future policy solutions. Then I talk about my more like specific conclusion, which if it was today, I might reverse this order and talk about my more specific thing was about how carcerality, right? We use safety narratives to justify carceral solutions, but really this carcerality contradicts the goal of safety in the first place. And then I call to arms, like maybe we should just approach psychiatry with compassion and respect and not imprisonment. And then I have my references section so that, I mean, it's very highly unlikely that anybody would want to look at every single source, but if somebody's interested and they see one thing that they just can't believe, and they might want to go, okay, Kafer, all right, I see you. Let me go see what that book was, because I'd like to read that. And that allows them to do that. So that was me talking through my poster sections.
Thank you, Alana. Julia, do you want to walk through yours, and then we'll open up for questions?
Yeah. So I am more of the science side of things. So I'm not going to try and take you through my project. I just have a lot of things on here that were lessons that I learned as I was putting together posters. So I'm going to start just very broadly, not specific sections of the poster, but one of the biggest things that I personally don't love as a science reader is when there's too much text on specifically a science poster, especially if you have data or background or things like that. I'm someone, in case you can't tell, who loves pictures. I think pictures can make things easier to understand for people outside of your discipline, but also make it less overwhelming, right? It's a lot easier to process a picture than it is to try and catch what people are saying while you're trying to read words on their poster. So I like to have a really good balance of pictures to words and white space on my poster. So I'll go ahead and start, I guess, knowing those facts about me with the abstract and the background. So like Alana said, I originally had a fully typed abstract and then didn't really like having it because I feel like, especially with science, you can distill it down into very simple things. And the biggest thing that I was always told, specifically with scientific posters or really just posters in general, is you should put enough information on your poster that someone could come up to it when you aren't there for some reason. Say you go to the bathroom and someone comes to look at your poster. You should have enough information that someone can understand your project without you present, but not so much that when you give a presentation, you're just restating what's on the poster. You want to give them the basic amount of information, and then when you give the presentation, you give new elements of depth. So I think by bulleting the abstract instead of overwhelming with the whole thing, it makes it a little bit easier to summarize. And if they want to read it, like I didn't reiterate my abstract to my presenter, the people listening to me, but they were able to read it afterwards. I had someone say, can I stop and read your abstract before I go? And then in terms of background, you want to make sure you give people sufficient background to understand the importance of the work that you're doing and the question that you're trying to answer. So you can put the question on your poster, you can say it verbally. Usually people can kind of get an idea from the title of your project. But one of the biggest things that I found helpful is I found it easiest to explain the background piece that I was talking about by using this schematic right here. So that's what I chose to do. I think a lot of times if you can give people, again, not using words, give people a picture to follow that has some text, you also have something to point to while you're talking, and that makes it a little bit easier too. In terms of methods, one of the cool things about science is there's a platform called BioRender. So if you haven't used BioRender before, it's basically, you can get a free license. Some labs will have licenses for you, but it's an open software platform that lets you create diagrams of any scientific concept that you want. So they have tons of pre-made little doodles and diagrams and things like that that you can use. So I chose to do my materials and methods this way instead of a typed format, because I found it easier to understand what I was doing when I could see it this way. But I also think for people who aren't science oriented, it's kind of interesting to them to see what does life in the lab look like? How do those different pieces fit together? And they can sort of visualize what you're doing so that when they look at your data, it's not like, I don't understand how you got there. How did you do that? What were you physically doing to collect all of that information? So that is why I chose to make my methods this way. And I think it gives, again, that minimum amount of information by saying this is the sequence of events of things that I did. But then when you give the presentation, you can explain in more depth of the examples. Like I always explain what RNA fish is because some people aren't familiar with it. In terms of how I organize my results, one of the things that one of my professors taught me was you want to lead people down your poster. So I tried to oppose my text boxes for these images because that way it gets people to read down the poster. And again, with the figure legends, figure captions, it's just the minimum amount of information that someone would need to understand all of the information in these figures. So I was lucky that this data, since it is just pictures of cells, I could tell people red is this and blue is this, and people could probably follow if I wasn't there. But again, the main thing that I like to do in my results is make a claim about what that specific data set is showing, give the base amount of information. And then again, if someone's not there, they can read the figure title, look at how to interpret the figure, in my case with the colors, and then use that to sort of work their way through my thought process if I'm not there. And if you are there, then it's just nice to have that handy as well. And then the big thing for me is I really like these little boxes for text because it just sort of offsets everything. And when I write a conclusion, I don't love writing big paragraphs because you're going to give, again, greater depth than what your poster says. So I tried to do just the surface level. This is what you can take away from the data that I showed you. And then some people like to do a future directions. I personally didn't, since the guidelines for these posters said these were the sections you had to have. But you could also do that here. I sort of worked a future direction into the conclusion because that was the format of the poster that was required. And then the last thing that I have is traditionally with science, since you're generating your own data, you don't really want to have a lot of references in your poster. The main places your references will come from are if you have a background section like I did here. I have some citations here as well as in the bulleted abstract because I referenced some information. And then I cite where my figures came from because BioRender asks that you give them credit when you use their platform. But other than that, I was told the cap in general that you want to have is around five references specifically for science people because this information should be based off of other people's knowledge, but you're generating new knowledge. So the majority of what you discuss, if it's an original project, should not be coming from the literature. But other than that, I think Alana hit a lot of the things. We have two very different posters, but I think Alana covered a lot of the things when she talked too. So that's sort of how I make a poster, the things that I think about. You can definitely add more text than me. I would say being at Mayo, I've seen on their posters, they tend to do more text than I was used to. So you can definitely have more text than I did. This is just a personal preference, but I think that is everything that I can think of.
I love how little text you have. It's so stylish. It's what I aspire to, honestly. It takes so much skill to do that.
One of the things that Bill and I highlighted for them on Monday was the RNA fish piece of the materials and methods for yours, Julia, because we still like however many months later, like about the Velcro.
Yes.
We still remember that. Like not science people, but I still remember that piece. So
I'm glad.
all right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you, Julia and Alana, for joining us today and for sharing your experiences.